Human beings domesticated the horse, yet the deeper change may have happened in the opposite direction. Our bodies remained slow, tied to the distance a person could walk, while our societies began to move farther and faster than human biology had ever allowed. Roads stretched, armies expanded, messages crossed continents, and power gathered around those who controlled movement. We shaped the horse for human purposes, but how much did the horse reshape us? What is the secret history of horses, and how did one animal rewire human civilization? Long before a horse carried a rider, pulled a cart, or appeared beneath a king, it belonged to a world that moved without human permission. Across open grasslands, cold plains, dry valleys, and the shifting edges of woodland, wild horses lived as herd animals shaped by distance, weather, predators, and the need to find food. Their survival depended on alert senses, strong social bonds, and the ability to move quickly across ground that offered little shelter. To early humans, these animals were not yet companions or engines of movement. They were animals in the landscape, difficult to approach, dangerous to corner, and valuable as sources of meat, hide, bone, sinew, and fat. Archaeological sites from different regions show that people hunted horses at various times, although the methods and importance of that hunting changed with local conditions. A horse could feed many people, but reaching one required knowledge of terrain, animal behavior, seasonal movement, and the risks of pursuit. In this first relationship, the horse did not shorten distance for humans. It often created distance, fleeing beyond the speed of the human body. That simple fact matters because the earliest human world was measured by walking. Our ancestors could travel far through endurance, cooperation, and careful planning. Yet every journey still depended on feet, carried supplies, available water, and the strength of the group. The horse possessed another kind of movement. It could cross open land rapidly, escape danger, and follow grazing over wide areas. Human beings could observe that power, hunt it, paint it, carve it, and remember it, but observation was not control. The long history between the two species began with inequality. Humans had hands, tools, language, and collective memory, while horses had speed, vigilance, and bodies built for sustained movement. Neither side was waiting for a bond. Wild horses had their own social lives, usually organized around groups within larger populations, with relationships shaped by age, sex, kinship, and changing environmental pressures. They communicated through posture, sound, scent, touch, and movement. These patterns were not designed for human use. They had evolved because they helped horses survive among other horses and avoid predators. For people living near them, understanding such behavior would have developed gradually through repeated encounters. Hunters learned where herds passed, when animals were vulnerable, and how wind or ground might reveal a human approach. Such knowledge came before domestication, and it connected the horse to the oldest human skill of all, learning to read a living landscape. At the beginning of our species' story, survival depended less on dominating nature than on noticing its rhythms. Tracks, broken grass, dung, distant calls, and the direction of a moving herd could all become information. The horse entered human awareness first as a sign within that wider world. Its presence could indicate water, grazing, predators, or a seasonal route through the land. Its absence could matter just as much. A vanished herd might mean hunger, migration, or the need to search elsewhere. This was not yet civilization being rewired. It was attention being trained. Over many generations, people accumulated practical knowledge about an animal whose strength could not easily be contained. Yet the same open environments that supported large grazing animals also exposed the limits of human mobility. A group could follow prey, carry children, move camp, and transport tools, but every object added weight, and every injured person slowed the journey. Distance was therefore not an empty space on a map. It was a physical cost paid in time, hunger, fatigue, and risk. Wild horses seemed to move through that cost differently. They embodied a speed that humans could witness, but not yet borrow. This contrast formed the quiet beginning of everything that followed. Before horses changed roads, warfare, trade, messages, and empires, they first stood beyond reach, reminding human beings that the landscape could be crossed in ways our own bodies did not allow. Before human beings could borrow the strength of horses, Every journey was negotiated with the limits of the human body. Our species is well adapted for endurance. We can walk for long periods, regulate heat through sweating, cooperate in groups, and carry knowledge across generations. Yet endurance is not the same as speed, and survival over distance always carried a cost. A person moving across open country needed water, food, shelter, tools, and enough energy to return or continue. Children, older adults, injuries, illness, pregnancy, and the weight of possessions could slow an entire group. The farther people travelled from familiar ground, the more carefully they had to judge weather, water, terrain, and the availability of food. Distance was therefore not only measured in steps, it was measured in fatigue, risk, and the amount of life that had to be supported along the way. This physical reality shaped the earliest human communities. People could move camps, follow seasonal resources, visit neighbouring groups, and cross impressive stretches of land, but each movement required planning and cooperation. What could be carried mattered as much as where people wished to go. Stone tools, hides, fuel, food, and infants all placed demands on the same muscles. A useful object left behind might be lost for good. A heavy load could reduce speed when danger appeared. Human mobility was flexible, but it was never free. The body set a boundary around communication, exchange, and memory. News travelled only as fast as a person could move. Help arrived only if someone could reach it. A distant relative, a promising hunting ground, or a safer valley might exist beyond several days of effort, turning geography into a social barrier. These limits did not make early people passive or isolated. Archaeology shows that materials sometimes moved across substantial distances, suggesting networks of exchange and contact. Yet such movement depended on repeated journeys, social ties, and knowledge built over generations. No single traveller erased the difficulty of space. The human body remained the basic unit of transport. Even the most experienced walker had to stop, sleep, drink, and recover. The beginning of our species was therefore shaped by a tension between curiosity and physical constraint. Humans were capable of imagining places beyond the horizon, remembering routes, and sharing descriptions, but imagination did not remove weight from the back or pain from the feet. This tension influenced settlement, kinship, conflict, and the spread of ideas. Communities near rivers, passes, coastlines, and reliable water could become connected in ways that more difficult landscapes resisted. A mountain range, desert, or broad grassland was not simply scenery. It determined how often people met, how quickly danger could be reported, and how much food could be moved before it spoiled. Horses would later alter these calculations, but only because the calculations already existed. Their importance cannot be understood by looking only at battlefields or royal processions. It began with ordinary human limits. How far a message could travel before it became old. How much grain could be carried before the carrier was exhausted. How quickly a family could leave danger, and whether a person could return from a distant journey before weather changed. This scale also shaped time itself, because a decision made in one camp might remain unknown elsewhere for days or weeks. Separation protected communities from some threats, yet it could also delay warning, assistance, trade, reunion, and the sharing of knowledge. The horse did not remove hunger, injury, or uncertainty, and it did not make every traveller equal. What it eventually offered was a new relationship between energy and distance. Before that relationship developed, human beings lived inside a world scaled to walking. Paths formed around water and memory. Encounters depended on patience. Movement was measured by daylight and rest. The body was both the vehicle and the burden, carrying human intention only as far as muscle, breath, and endurance allowed. For most of the time that humans and horses shared the same landscapes, the horse remained faster than any person who followed it. A herd disturbed on open ground could move beyond reach in moments, while hunters were left with tracks, dust, and the fading sound of hooves. This difference was more than a contest of speed. It revealed two distinct ways of surviving. Humans depended on endurance, cooperation, tools, memory, and the ability to plan across time. Horses depended on alertness, rapid movement, social coordination, and bodies able to turn grass into sustained motion. Each species carried strength the other did not possess, but only humans would eventually try to combine them. Long before that happened, the distance between a running horse and a walking person remained a visible boundary. People could predict routes, guide animals toward difficult ground, or use the shape of the landscape during a hunt, yet no method removed the physical inequality between human legs and equine movement. The horse could escape across country that took a person hours to cross. It could relocate with a herd, respond quickly to danger, and carry its own body without the burden of tools, shelter, or stored food. To people whose lives were measured by daylight and carried weight, this ability must have been repeatedly observable, although archaeology cannot tell us exactly what individuals thought about it. What can be said is that human communities learn from repeated contact. They recognized trails, seasonal patterns, preferred grazing areas, and signs of fear or calm. Such knowledge belonged within the same deep human inheritance that allowed our ancestors to survive by reading animals, plants, water, and weather. The beginning of human history was not a sudden rise above nature. It was a long dependence on careful attention. Horses entered that attention as powerful, mobile animals whose behavior could sometimes be anticipated but not yet reliably directed. This distinction matters because control did not appear simply when someone came close enough to touch a horse. A lasting relationship required changes in routine, knowledge, trust, restraint, feeding, reproduction, and the organization of human labor. It also required horses capable of tolerating conditions that wild animals usually avoided. The future bond was therefore not hidden inside one dramatic encounter. It had to emerge through many small adjustments, some of which may have occurred in different places and for different purposes. Before riding became common, people may have valued horses for meat, milk, hides, status, exchange, or herd management, depending on the community and period. The evidence does not support a single universal path. What remained constant was the possibility contained in the animal's body. A horse could move faster than a human, carry more than a human, and repeat that movement over useful distances when properly cared for. Once people learned to make that capacity dependable, the scale of human action could begin to expand. Yet at this early stage, none of that future was guaranteed. Wild horses were still living beings with their own fear, resistance, social bonds, and needs. They could injure handlers, flee confinement, suffer from poor care, or fail to reproduce under unfamiliar conditions. The transformation of the relationship required more than courage. It required accumulated knowledge passed from one generation to another. In that sense, the deepest change did not begin on a battlefield or royal road. It began when observation became management, and management became a tradition. Human beings had always extended themselves through tools, fire, language, and cooperation. The horse offered something different, not an object held in the hand, but another living body whose strength could never be completely separated from its own will. That possibility would slowly turn the limit of walking into a new and uncertain, distant horizon for human communities. The great question was no longer whether humans could follow horses, but whether two species could learn to move through history together. The earliest stages of horse domestication left no written account, so the story has to be reconstructed from traces that were never meant to explain themselves. Archaeologists begin with bones, teeth, tools, soils, and the arrangement of ancient settlements, then compare these remains across places and generations. A horse bone found beside a hearth does not prove that the animal was domesticated. It may show only that people hunted, butchered, cooked, or stored part of a carcass. To move beyond that simple observation, researchers look for patterns. They ask whether horses appear in unusually large numbers, whether animals of certain ages or sexes were selected, whether remains are concentrated near dwellings, and whether the surrounding landscape could have supported managed herds. They also compare horse remains with those of cattle, sheep, goats, and wild prey, because each animal may have occupied a different place in the local economy. Each clue narrows the possibilities, but few clues can stand alone. Teeth are especially useful because they preserve a record of growth, diet, movement, and sometimes repeated contact with equipment. Changes in wear may suggest how an animal fed or whether something pressed against the mouth. Although such marks can have more than one cause, chemical signatures inside teeth and bones can also reveal where an animal spent its early life, and whether it later moved to another region. This allows researchers to ask whether horses were local, traded, driven seasonally, or gathered from distant herds. These methods do not produce a perfect biography, but they can show that human and animal movements were becoming connected in new ways. The oldest human relationship with horses began in hunting, so domestication cannot be identified simply by the presence of many horse remains. A settlement near a migration route might contain large quantities of bone without any evidence that people controlled living animals. Archaeologists therefore examine the ages of the horses that died. Wild hunting often reflects opportunity, while herd management can create more regular choices about which animals are kept, killed, or allowed to reproduce. Even then, the pattern may remain uncertain because climate, disease, or seasonal scarcity can alter the structure of both wild and managed populations. The ground around an ancient settlement may preserve another kind of evidence. Enclosed spaces, repeated layers of dung, changes in soil chemistry, and microscopic remains of plants can sometimes suggest that animals were kept near people. Residues absorbed into pottery may indicate the processing of animal products, including milk, but identifying the exact species and meaning of those residues requires care. A community could use horse milk without riding, and it could control some horses without creating the lineage from which most later domestic horses descended. This is why the history of domestication cannot be reduced to a single invention. Different communities may have developed different relationships with horses, some temporary and some lasting. Ancient DNA has added a powerful line of evidence by allowing researchers to compare horses from widely separated periods. Genetic patterns can reveal population replacement, interbreeding, loss of diversity, and the spread of lineages associated with later domestic herds. Yet genetics also has limits. A sample represents one animal from one location, and many regions remain poorly sampled. The absence of a lineage in the surviving record does not prove it never existed. What matters is the agreement between several kinds of evidence. Bones can describe bodies, teeth can preserve life history, residues can show use, settlements can reveal routine, and DNA can trace ancestry. When these records point in the same direction, a gradual change becomes visible. People were no longer meeting horses only at the end of a hunt. In some places, they were learning to keep them close, shape their reproduction, and build daily labor around their needs. The beginning of this relationship was therefore not a moment when humanity suddenly mastered the horse. It was a long accumulation of small, practical decisions that slowly altered the future of both species. At Botai, in the grasslands of northern Kazakhstan, archaeologists found a settlement whose remains seemed to bring people unusually close to horses. The site contained houses, tools, pottery, and an immense quantity of horse bones. For many years, this concentration appeared to offer a clear beginning for horse domestication. The people who lived there depended heavily on horses, and evidence from pottery suggested that they processed horse milk. Certain patterns in teeth were also interpreted as possible signs that some animals had been controlled with equipment placed in the mouth. Taken together, these clues made Botai central to the story of how humans first began managing horses. Yet scientific understanding changed as new methods became available. Ancient DNA showed that the horses associated with Botai were not the direct ancestors of the lineage that later spread across most of Eurasia and gave rise to the great majority of modern domestic horses. Instead, they belonged to a different branch closely connected with the ancestors of the horses now known as Przewalski's horses. This discovery did not make Botai unimportant. It made the story more complicated, and therefore more honest. The people of Botai may still have kept, milked, managed, or perhaps ridden some horses, but their relationship with those animals appears to have remained geographically limited. It did not become the single expanding population from which later horse-powered societies descended. Botai therefore teaches an essential lesson about the beginning of human relationships with animals. A community can develop sophisticated practices without those practices becoming the foundation of every later tradition. Human history is filled with experiments that worked locally, lasted for generations, and then disappeared or were absorbed into other systems. The horse did not enter civilization through one doorway. Different groups may have approached wild populations in different ways, using animals for food, milk, transport, status, or exchange. Some forms of management may have ended without leaving descendants among later domestic herds. Others may have influenced knowledge even when their animals did not survive as a major lineage. This is difficult to prove because skills do not fossilize. A technique for calming a horse, selecting a manageable animal, protecting a herd through winter, or collecting milk could pass between people without leaving a clear genetic signature. Archaeology can recover vessels, bones, soils, and teeth, but it rarely preserves the spoken instructions that made daily work possible. Botai also reminds us that domestication is not identical to complete control. People may manage an animal population while still depending on wild capture. They may keep some animals near settlements, but allow others to range widely. They may use milk without relying on mounted travel, or ride occasionally without creating a society organized around rapid movement. Each practice represents a different degree of connection between two species. At the origin of this relationship, boundaries may have remained flexible for a long time. The horses could be useful and still dangerous, familiar and still partly beyond human control. Later populations of domestic horses spread with remarkable speed across Eurasia, but that expansion occurred after the Botai period and involved a different genetic lineage. The contrast prevents a simple story in which one discovery immediately transformed the world. Instead, it reveals a slower process of trial, loss, replacement, and renewed learning. Botai stands not as a failed beginning, but as evidence that human beings were exploring close relationships with horses before the lineage of modern domestic horses became widespread. What survived was not necessarily one unbroken population. It may have been the broader human realization that the power of a living herd could be organized, sustained, and passed from one generation to the next. That realization was not yet the mobility revolution promised by the horse's body. It was a quieter change in human routine. People had to gather fodder, watch movement, recognize illness, manage reproduction, and remain near enough to intervene. The horse was beginning to enter the structure of daily life, even before it entered the great roads of history. There was no single morning when a wild horse became a domestic animal, and no surviving evidence points to one person who discovered how to control an entire species. The change was more likely built from repeated contact, practical experiments, and knowledge passed through many generations. At first, people may have followed herds as hunters, learning where horses grazed, drank, rested, and moved with the seasons. Later, some communities began keeping animals closer, separating certain individuals, protecting them from predators, or preventing them from leaving. These actions did not immediately create the horse known to later civilizations. They created new conditions in which human choices could begin to influence equine lives. A captured animal had to tolerate proximity, unfamiliar sounds, restraint, and the presence of people. Many horses would have remained too fearful, aggressive, or difficult to manage. Calmer individuals may have been easier to keep, feed, milk, exchange, or breed, although the surviving evidence cannot reveal every reason behind those choices. Over time, repeated selection could change the behavior of a population even before obvious differences appeared in the skeleton. This is one reason the earliest stages of domestication are so difficult to identify. Bones may look similar while daily relationships have already begun to change. Management itself could also take several forms. People might control a small number of horses while continuing to hunt wild herds. They might collect milk from mares without depending on mounted travel. They might keep animals for food, ceremony, exchange, or social value before riding became common. Some communities may have tried practices that ended when climate shifted, settlements moved, disease spread, or local traditions disappeared. Others may have learned techniques from neighboring groups and adapted them to different landscapes. The origin of the human relationship with horses was therefore not a straight road leading inevitably toward cavalry and empire. It was a network of experiments, only some of which left descendants in later horse populations. The care of living animals demanded routines that hunting alone did not require. Horses needed access to water, suitable grazing, protection during difficult seasons, and enough space to remain healthy. Injured animals had to be treated or abandoned. Young horses had to survive long enough to reproduce. Breeding animals had to be recognized and managed, even if early selection was less controlled than it became in later societies. Every success depended on close observation. People learned how horses responded to touch, pressure, voice, movement, and the behavior of other horses. Such knowledge could not be stored in a tool. It survived only when experienced people demonstrated it to others. In this way, domestication altered human culture as well as animal biology. A community that kept horses had to organize labor around creatures that ate each day, moved unpredictably, and possessed enough strength to injure a careless handler. The human body remained slower, but human cooperation could now surround, guide, and sustain the faster body of another species. Ancient genetic evidence shows that the lineage behind most later domestic horses expanded widely only after earlier relationships with horses had already existed elsewhere. This suggests that closeness came before global success. People had learned several ways of living with horses before one population became especially widespread. What eventually transformed distance was not the first captured foal, the first taste of mare's milk, or even the first uncertain ride. It was the creation of a dependable tradition in which horses could be raised, handled, reproduced, and transferred beyond the lifetime of one person. That continuity mattered because a horse was never a finished machine. Each new animal had to be taught, observed, and integrated into human routines, while each new handler had to learn patience and restraint. The relationship survived only when both biological reproduction and cultural memory remained connected through time together. Domestication became historically powerful when knowledge and animals could both move from one generation to the next. Before speed could become useful, a horse had to remain near enough for a person to approach, feed, guide, restrain, and eventually trust with weight. This was not a minor condition. Horses evolved as alert grazing animals whose survival often depended on noticing danger early and moving away from it quickly. A sudden sound, unfamiliar shape, or careless touch could trigger withdrawal or flight. Strength alone, therefore, did not make a horse valuable to a human community. An animal that panicked easily, resisted handling, or injured those around it could consume food and labor without providing dependable help. The first important transformation was not faster travel, it was the creation of a relationship stable enough for repeated contact. Modern studies show that horses differ from one another in fearfulness, responsiveness, curiosity, and tolerance of human handling. Experience also matters. Repeated calm exposure can change how an individual reacts, while rough or unpredictable treatment can deepen avoidance and stress. Archaeology cannot reveal the temperament of a particular ancient horse, and it cannot tell us exactly how early handlers understood these differences. Still, communities that managed living herds would have encountered the same practical reality. Some animals were easier to approach, some learned routines more readily, and some remained difficult or dangerous. Choosing which horses to keep and breed could gradually influence behavior, even when people were not thinking in terms of genes or formal selection. The beginning of this process belonged to the oldest human practice of watching carefully. A handler had to notice the direction of the ears, the tension of the body, the position within the herd, and the moment when pressure became too much. Such details could determine whether an animal stayed, fled, or struck out. Human hands and tools could impose restraint, but force alone could not create a reliable working animal. A horse powerful enough to carry or pull was also powerful enough to resist. Daily usefulness depended on reducing uncertainty through familiarity, routine, and learned signals. This required time, and time connected animal behavior to human social structure. Knowledge had to be taught. Children and inexperienced adults could not safely manage horses without observing people who already understood them. Feeding, catching, leading, calming, and separating animals became skills stored in memory rather than in stone or bone. At the origin of horsekeeping, this cultural inheritance may have mattered as much as any physical change in the animals themselves. A calmer horse could be lost, stolen, or killed, but a community that retained the knowledge of handling could begin again. Temperament also shaped what could be asked of the animal. A horse kept for meat or milk did not need to accept every demand later required by riding, traction, warfare, or crowded roads. Each new use introduced unfamiliar pressures: weight on the back, equipment around the head, confinement, separation from companions, loud noise, and movement directed by a human rather than by the herd. Animals varied in their ability to tolerate these demands, and handlers varied in their skill. The horse that eventually transformed distance was therefore not simply the fastest horse available. It was an animal whose speed could be approached, guided, stopped, and repeated without constant struggle. This did not erase fear or turn a living creature into a machine. The flight response remained part of equine biology, and every working relationship still depended on care, experience, and conditions. What changed was the degree to which humans could make movement predictable. Long before roads carried messengers and armies, people were learning to turn sensitivity into communication and raw strength into cooperation. Without such predictability, speed remained an admired distance between species, not yet a force that human societies could organize. Civilization would later celebrate the horse in motion, but the deeper beginning lay in stillness. A powerful animal remaining beside a human long enough for both to learn what the other would do. A manageable temperament was only the beginning, because living with horses required a body of practical knowledge that no single animal could provide. A calm horse still needed water, forage, shelter from severe weather, protection from injury, and careful attention to the condition of its feet, skin, teeth, and limbs. People also had to understand the herd itself. Horses are social animals, and separating one individual, introducing a newcomer, or moving a group into unfamiliar ground could change behavior in ways that affected both safety and survival. None of this knowledge appeared fully formed. It had to be learned through repeated success, error, observation, and correction. Archaeology rarely preserves these daily lessons, yet any community that kept horses for long periods must have organized time and labor around them. Someone had to watch the animals, guide them toward water, notice signs of weakness, and decide which individuals could be handled safely. These responsibilities made the horse more than a resource collected from the landscape. It became a continuing obligation whose needs returned every morning. Breeding added another layer of difficulty. Horses reproduce slowly, compared with many smaller domestic animals, and each young animal requires years of growth before it can perform demanding work. A community could not rapidly replace losses caused by disease, accident, harsh winters, or conflict. Keeping enough breeding animals therefore required patience and restraint. People had to preserve some healthy adults, rather than using every available horse for immediate food or labor. They may also have favored individuals that were easier to manage, physically sound, or suited to local conditions, although the precise choices of early breeders cannot be recovered with certainty. Over generations, such decisions could influence both behavior and body form. Ancient genetic evidence indicates that the population behind most later domestic horses expanded together with increasingly organized breeding, but genes alone cannot reconstruct the human routines that sustained that expansion. At the beginning of the human story with horses, culture and biology were already becoming intertwined. A foal inherited traits from its parents, yet it also entered a world shaped by human contact. It learned whether approaching people brought food, pressure, restraint, discomfort, or calm repetition. Handlers learned in return. They discovered which signals could direct movement, how much pressure an animal would accept, and when fear made further demands unsafe. Modern research shows that horses learn through consistent associations, and that confused or harsh handling can increase fear and resistance. It would be wrong to project modern training systems directly into prehistory, but the underlying need for consistency would have existed whenever people asked horses to repeat controlled actions. Skills therefore had to pass between humans as carefully as breeding animals passed between herds. An experienced handler could demonstrate where to stand, how to approach, when to release pressure, and how to recognize rising tension before it became dangerous. Spoken explanation, imitation, and long practice turned individual experience into shared tradition. This was one of the quiet ways the horse began reshaping human society. Keeping horses created specialized competence, and specialized competence created dependence on people who possessed it. A settlement might own animals, but their usefulness rested on remembered methods held inside living minds and practiced bodies. When communities exchanged horses, moved across regions, or joined larger networks, they could also exchange these methods. The spread of horsekeeping was therefore not simply the movement of animals across a map. It was the movement of routines, judgments, and standards of care. If that chain of teaching broke, even a valuable herd could become difficult to manage within a generation. If it endured, each new handler began not from ignorance, but from a foundation built by people whose names and experiences have disappeared. Long before mounted travellers crossed great distances, knowledge itself had to cross generations. A horse could carry a person only after human memory had learned how to carry the horse. A horse became historically powerful only when its usefulness could be repeated. One skilled handler riding one unusually calm animal might travel farther than a person on foot, but that achievement alone could not reshape a community. The animal could die, escape, become injured, or fail to reproduce. The rider could take knowledge to the grave. For mobility to become dependable, people needed more than isolated success. They needed breeding herds, regular care, trained animals, shared methods, and enough social stability to preserve all of them through difficult seasons. This was the point at which the horse began to move from personal ability into collective infrastructure. A community had to produce new animals before older ones were lost. Foals required years of feeding and handling before they could carry weight or perform demanding work. Mares, stallions, and young animals could not all be used in the same way, and losses could not be replaced quickly. The herd therefore tied present choices to future needs. Using every healthy animal immediately might solve a short problem while weakening the next generation. Protecting breeding stock, maintaining access to pasture, and teaching young horses to accept human direction required patience, extending beyond one journey or one lifetime. Ancient genomic research suggests that the horse lineage behind most later domestic populations expanded widely during the Bronze Age, alongside signs of increasingly controlled breeding. The evidence does not reveal one simple invention, but it does show that a particular population eventually multiplied and moved across Eurasia with unusual speed. Such an expansion could not have depended on captured wild animals alone. It required a system capable of producing horses in sufficient numbers and transferring them between communities. Human knowledge travelled with those animals. A horse raised in one place might be exchanged, gifted, taken in conflict, or moved with people into another landscape, but its usefulness still depended on someone who knew how to feed, handle, and direct it. At the origin of this expanding relationship, mobility became a social accomplishment. Grazing land had to be found. Water had to remain accessible. People had to recognize illness, protect hooves, manage injuries, and prevent valuable animals from disappearing with a frightened herd. Equipment had to be made and repaired from materials that decayed and rarely survived in the archaeological record. None of these tasks looked as dramatic as a rider crossing an open plain, yet the rider depended on all of them. Reproducible mobility also changed the meaning of skill. A successful tradition could not rely on one exceptional person. Signals had to become consistent enough for different handlers and animals to understand one another. Young people had to learn where to stand, how to approach, when to apply pressure and when to release it. Horses had to become familiar with repeated routines, human voices, equipment, separation, and unfamiliar ground. The process remained imperfect. Animals could resist, panic, tire, or suffer under poor treatment, and people could misunderstand them. Dependability did not mean complete control. It meant that uncertainty had been reduced enough for communities to plan around equine movement. Once that threshold was crossed, the consequences extended beyond the horsekeepers themselves. A traveller could expect another usable animal to exist after the first was exhausted. A herd could supply mounts over time rather than for a single expedition. Knowledge could survive the death of an experienced rider because it had been distributed among families, workers, and generations. The human body had not become faster, yet society had learned to reproduce access to another body's speed. This was the deeper change. The horse was no longer merely an animal that someone might ride. It was becoming a renewable form of movement supported by land, labour, memory, and life across distances that had once belonged only to the strongest walkers, seasonal trails, and the uncertain endurance of those carrying everything they needed on their backs through time. Once horses could be raised and handled with some reliability, distance began to change its meaning. Human beings had always travelled, sometimes across remarkable stretches of land, but travel on foot demanded time, strength, and careful choices about what could be carried. A person could walk for many hours, yet every extra load reduced speed and increased fatigue. Food, water, tools, clothing, and children all had to move with the group. A journey that crossed open country could consume days, and the return required the same effort in reverse. The horse did not erase these limits, but it altered the balance between energy and movement. A rider could cover ground more quickly, carry supplies, and return before conditions changed. This advantage was not identical everywhere. Mountains, forests, marshes, heat, cold, and poor grazing could reduce the usefulness of horses, while open grasslands often allowed them to move and feed more easily. Even so, the possibility of travelling beyond the ordinary scale of walking introduced a new kind of geography into human life. A neighbouring settlement that once seemed distant could become reachable within a shorter span of daylight. Seasonal grazing areas could be connected more regularly. People could search farther for water, animals, pasture, or missing members of a herd. The landscape itself had not become smaller, but the time needed to cross it had begun to shrink. At the beginning of human history with horses, this change was probably uneven and limited to communities with enough animals, knowledge, and grazing land to support them. A horse needed food and rest, and one exhausted animal could not carry a rider without end. Reliable mobility required several horses, routes with water, and people who understood when an animal was reaching its limits. The new speed was therefore not free. It was supported by pasture, labour, breeding, and accumulated experience. Yet once these supports existed, movement could be planned differently. A person might leave camp, inspect animals at a distant grazing place, deliver a warning, and return sooner than a walker could complete the same route. Goods that were too heavy or awkward for one person could be divided between animals or transported with less strain on human bodies. The elderly, injured, or very young were still vulnerable, but the community now possessed another way to move people and necessities through space. This changed more than travel. It altered what could be known. Information had always moved with human messengers, but a mounted traveller could carry news farther before it became outdated. A report about danger, weather, grazing, trade, or the movement of another group could arrive while there was still time to respond. Decisions made in one place could begin to influence people living beyond the usual reach of a day's walk. The horse extended the range of human attention, joining places that had once remained separated by delay. It also changed the emotional weight of absence. A relative, trading partner, or seasonal camp might still be far away, but the journey between them no longer required the same surrender of time. Contact could become more frequent, although access remained unequal and depended on ownership, skill, and local conditions. This inequality would later shape power, but its earliest form was quieter. Some people could reach resources, allies, and information sooner than others. The human body itself had not evolved new speed. Instead, society had learned to organize another body around human intentions. The result was not complete freedom from geography. Rivers still flooded, winters still closed routes, and exhausted horses still needed care. What changed was the boundary of the practical world. Beyond the old circle of walking, a wider landscape was becoming available to memory, exchange, decision, and return. For communities shaped by repeated movement, that expansion could slowly influence where camps were placed, which routes were remembered, how risks were judged, and how far responsibility extended beyond familiar ground. As horses became dependable companions in movement, they changed the way some communities could live with seasons. Herding had always required attention to grass, water, weather, and the needs of animals, but mounted travel made it easier to watch wider areas and respond more quickly when conditions shifted. A grazing place that had begun to fail could be inspected before an entire household moved. Animals separated from the group could be reached sooner. Water sources farther from camp could enter the daily range of decision. These advantages did not create unlimited mobility, because horses themselves needed pasture and water, and a dry season could weaken the very animals people depended on. Yet the relationship between people, livestock, and land became more flexible. Communities could connect winter shelter, spring grazing, summer pasture, and autumn routes across a larger territory, carrying memory from one season into the next. This seasonal movement was not wandering without order. It depended on detailed knowledge of when grass returned, where snow remained shallow, which valleys flooded, and how long a herd could stay before damaging the ground or exhausting local resources. Horses expanded the distance over which such knowledge could be used. A rider could travel ahead, inspect conditions, return with information, and helped guide decisions before hunger forced a hurried departure. The beginning of human reliance on horses therefore changed planning as much as speed. Movement could become less dependent on immediate crisis and more connected to anticipation. It also affected the structure of work. People on foot could still herd animals, gather food, repair shelters, care for children, and manage camp, while mounted members ranged farther to search, guard, or communicate. This did not remove labour. It redistributed it. The horse required feeding, training, and care, but it also allowed some tasks to be completed across distances that would otherwise consume much of the day. Over generations, routes could become inherited knowledge. Children learned not only where their community stayed, but how different places belonged to one seasonal cycle. A distant river, high pasture, sheltered basin, and trading place could form a connected human geography, even when they were occupied at different times. At the origin of these wider landscapes, the horse became a bridge between locations rather than a simple means of escape from one place. Mobility also helped maintain relationships among communities separated by open country. Visits could occur more often. News of marriage, illness, conflict, or available grazing could travel before circumstances changed. Animals, tools, and food could be exchanged over larger areas, though every exchange remained shaped by trust, risk, and unequal access to horses. A mounted group could arrive sooner than expected, bringing assistance or danger. The same mobility that supported cooperation could also increase competition over water, pasture, and herds. For this reason, the horse did not create a peaceful world of connection. It made relationships more immediate. Distance no longer protected communities in the same way, and information about movement became increasingly valuable. Seasonal life grew larger in space, but also more demanding in coordination. People had to know not only where resources existed, but who else might be using them, how quickly another group could arrive, and whether a route remained safe. The horse entered population history through these repeated contacts. More frequent meetings could support exchange, marriage, alliance, and the circulation of skills, while conflict and displacement could also reshape where families lived. Generations grew up within territories that were broader than the camps visible around them. Their world included paths remembered from previous seasons and people encountered beyond the horizon. Human beings had not escaped dependence on climate or animal bodies. They had learned to move through those limits with greater reach. Each route joined ecological knowledge to social memory, making mobility a practice renewed through every seasonal journey and return. In doing so, they turned scattered places into an organized landscape of return. When horse-based movement became dependable, the human world did not merely become faster, it became wider in a social sense. Places once separated by several days of walking could enter the same network of exchange, obligation, rivalry, and memory. A rider could carry news between settlements before the facts had changed, bring a small, valuable object across open country, or reach relatives who would otherwise remain distant for long periods. These movements did not erase isolation, and many communities still lived beyond regular contact, but they increased the number of people who could remain connected across space. The beginning of human life with horses therefore altered population structure as well as travel. A family could maintain relationships with partners, allies, and relatives farther away. Marriage ties could link communities across broader territories. Skills, stories, tools, and customs could circulate with the people who carried them. This did not mean that every idea spread quickly, or that cultures became uniform. Distance, language, terrain, weather, and distrust still slowed contact. Yet the horse gave some societies a new way to move information before it became useless, and to preserve relationships before separation turned into complete disconnection. Exchange also changed in scale. Goods that were rare in one place could reach another more regularly, especially when pack animals or mounted travelers reduced the burden on human carriers. Salt, metal, hides, crafted objects, food, and animals themselves could move through chains of communities rather than remaining near their sources. The value of an object began to depend not only on how it was made, but on whether people and animals could carry it safely across distance. Routes became more than paths through land. They became lines of trust, risk, and repeated expectation. A traveller needed water, grazing, shelter, and permission to pass. Communities along a route could gain influence by providing these things. while those excluded from movement could become more vulnerable. At the origin of this larger human world, speed was already becoming unequal. Some households possessed horses, knowledge, and access to pasture, while others depended on those who controlled them. The same animal that connected distant people could therefore deepen differences within and between communities. A mounted messenger could warn allies, but a mounted raiding party could arrive before a settlement had time to prepare. Herds could be traded, gifted, stolen, or captured. Information about roads, water, and seasonal movement became a form of power because knowing where others would travel made cooperation and attack more predictable. The horse did not create conflict, but it altered the time available for response. Danger could cross the horizon faster than before, and safety could no longer be measured only by walking distance. This wider world also changed how people imagined territory. A community's meaningful landscape might include places rarely seen by most of its members. A distant pasture known through returning herders, a trading ground remembered from seasonal meetings, or a river crossed by messengers carrying news. Space became organized through connection rather than continuous settlement. The human mind had always been able to remember places beyond sight, but horse-based movement made those places more active in daily decisions. A drought far away could affect grazing plans. A conflict beyond the next valley could close a route. A marriage agreement between distant groups could influence where people moved in the following season. Events in one location began to produce consequences across a larger field. This was one of the earliest ways horses helped rewire civilization. They did not simply carry bodies. They carried relationships, delays, promises, warnings, and claims over land. By shortening the time between separate communities, they made distant people more present in one another's lives. The world remained vast, but it became less silent between horizons, and human history began to unfold across spaces too large for a single person to walk in one day. From that point onward, distance was no longer only an obstacle in the landscape. It was something societies could organize, exploit, and remember. The chariot was not created by simply placing a horse in front of a wheel. It depended on several technologies and forms of knowledge working together at the same time. People needed horses that could tolerate harness, noise, confinement, and the movement of another animal beside them. They needed wheels light enough to turn quickly, axles strong enough to carry human weight, and a frame that could survive repeated shocks from uneven ground. They also needed leather, wood, skilled hands, and methods for joining separate parts into a vehicle that would not fail when speed increased. The earliest well-supported evidence for light, horse-drawn vehicles appears in the Bronze Age societies of the Eurasian steppe, where burials preserve wheel impressions, horse remains, and equipment associated with teams. These finds do not reveal one inventor or one sudden revolution. They show that several older traditions had come together: wheeled transport, horse management, woodworking, metalworking, and the training of people and animals. Earlier wagons were useful for moving heavy goods, but they were generally slower and more massive. A chariot required a different balance. Weight had to be reduced without making the vehicle too fragile. Spoked wheels helped create a lighter structure than solid wheels, but their construction demanded precision. If the wheel was poorly shaped, the vehicle could shake, tilt, or break. If the axle was misaligned, speed would increase danger rather than usefulness. The horses also had to pull as a coordinated pair. One animal moving too quickly, turning unexpectedly, or reacting in fear could disrupt the entire team. The driver therefore controlled not one body, but a small system of bodies, materials, signals, and motion. This was a new relationship between human intention and animal power. At the beginning of humanity's partnership with horses, a rider could guide one animal beneath the body. The chariot placed the human behind the animals and transformed their forward movement through wheels. It allowed a person to stand, carry equipment, and travel without placing the full load directly on a horse's back. Yet every visible moment of speed rested on labor that remained out of sight. Trees had to be selected and cut. Wood had to be seasoned, shaped, fitted, and repaired. Hides had to be processed into straps. Metal tools and fittings required access to materials and specialist work. Horses needed pasture, water, training, and recovery. Drivers had to learn how to turn, stop, and keep a team aligned. A broken wheel, injured horse, or missing craftsman could make the vehicle useless. The chariot was therefore not merely an object owned by a warrior. It was the result of a community capable of supporting specialists and protecting resources over time. This helps explain why such vehicles could become connected with status and authority. Not every household could maintain the animals, equipment, and skilled labor they required. The ability to appear in a fast vehicle demonstrated access to land, breeding stock, craftsmen, and organized support. Even before the chariot entered battle, it could display concentrated power. It also widened the difference between those who moved with institutional support and those who still travelled on foot. The horse had already extended human reach, but the chariot gathered that reach into a visible machine. In a durable new form, animal speed, wheel technology, and social organisation were joined in a form that could carry human authority across open ground. What looked like two horses and a platform was a civilization learning to coordinate wood, muscle, memory, and labour into controlled movement. Its importance lay not in replacing human effort, but in reorganising it. Many people now work so that a few could move rapidly. The faster the vehicle appeared, the more preparation stood behind it. This pattern would return throughout horse-powered history, whenever public speed depended on hidden systems of breeding, maintenance, roads, supply, and care. The chariot made that pattern visible for the first time. Once the chariot became reliable enough to carry people at speed, movement itself began to acquire political meaning. A ruler who appeared in a vehicle drawn by trained horses was not displaying only personal wealth. The scene revealed control over pasture, breeding animals, craftsmen, metal, wood, leather, drivers, and the labour needed to keep all of them working together. Speed became visible evidence that many resources had been gathered under one authority. Most people still moved on foot, carried loads with their own bodies, or relied on slower carts. The chariot therefore created a clear contrast between ordinary movement and protected movement. It allowed certain people to cross open ground quickly, while others supported that motion from behind. This difference helped turn mobility into rank. In ceremonies, processions, and elite burials, the vehicle could represent power even when it was not being used in battle. Its presence suggested that the owner belonged to a social world capable of commanding animals, specialists, and land. The horse had once stood beyond human reach as a wild creature of the grasslands. Now, its controlled speed could be placed beneath a political image. The transformation was not only practical, it changed how authority looked. A person standing above the ground in a fast vehicle appeared separate from those walking beside it. The height, sound, and motion of the chariot could make power seem immediate and difficult to approach. Yet that impression depended on preparation. Horses had to be fed before the procession, wheels checked, harness repaired, and routes kept passable. Political display was therefore built from quiet labour, performed by people whose names rarely entered written records. The more impressive the appearance, the more invisible support stood behind it. Warfare increased this effect, though the role of chariots differed across regions and periods. On suitable terrain, they could move fighters, carry weapons, pursue retreating enemies, or bring commanders rapidly between different points. They could also serve as mobile platforms from which trained warriors used bows or other weapons. Their usefulness depended on ground conditions, organization, and tactics. Mud, broken land, forests, steep slopes, or frightened horses could reduce their advantage. A chariot was not an unstoppable machine. Its power came from coordination and from the ability of a society to place several organized systems at the same location at the same time. When that coordination succeeded, speed could influence the outcome of conflict before direct fighting even began. A force that moved faster could scout farther, respond sooner, and threaten a wider area. Communities without comparable mobility had less time to prepare. Distance, which had once protected settlements by delaying attackers, became less dependable. This change linked the horse to the growth of larger political territories. Leaders who could move messages, officials, and military forces more quickly could try to influence places farther from the centre. Control was never complete, and ancient states often struggled with rebellion, difficult terrain, and slow communication. Still, horse-drawn movement expanded what rulers could attempt. Roads, staging areas, storage, and access to replacement animals became extensions of authority. The human body remained slow, but institutions learned to move selected people faster than the populations they governed. At the origin of this political change was a simple imbalance. The chariot turned that imbalance into a public language. It announced that speed belonged to those who controlled the system supporting it. Over time, images of rulers, warriors, and divine figures in chariots reinforced this association between mobility and elevated status. The vehicle could become more than transport. It could represent order, conquest, prestige, and the right to be seen moving differently from everyone else. Yet beneath every symbol remained the living bodies of horses, vulnerable to exhaustion, injury, fear, hunger, and heat. Political power borrowed their movement, but it could never escape their biological limits. The chariot made speed political because it concentrated social resources into motion, and because it allowed authority to appear not only stronger than ordinary life, but faster than it. The chariot appeared in art and ceremony as a symbol of speed, rank, and victory, yet the image concealed a chain of work that began far from the battlefield. Horses had to be bred, fed, trained, rested, and replaced, while wheels, axles, frames, reins, harness, and fittings demanded skilled hands and materials. A ruler could stand in a polished vehicle for a public moment only because many people had spent months preparing animals, shaping wood, treating leather, repairing damage, and storing food. The faster the chariot moved, the more this hidden system had to be maintained. A cracked wheel could end a journey, a lame horse could slow a unit, and a shortage of fodder could reduce military strength before an enemy appeared. Speed therefore depended on stillness, on workshops, stables, grazing land, water, storage, and routines repeated. Horses consumed resources even when they were not moving, which meant that keeping them required access to land that might otherwise support people or animals. Their needs connected elite mobility to the economy. Farmers grew or gathered feed, herders protected breeding stock, craftsmen repaired equipment, and servants cleaned, watered, and watched the animals. None of these tasks looked heroic, but without them, the chariot was only wood and leather. The beginning of the human relationship with horses had rested on attention to tracks, behavior, hunger, and fear. In the age of the chariot, that ancient attention did not disappear, it became organized labor. Someone still had to notice when a horse was tiring, refusing food, favoring one leg, or reacting badly to a companion. Political authority could command movement, but it could not command a body to ignore pain forever. This biological limit shaped strategy. Chariots worked best where terrain allowed wheels to turn and horses to maintain balance. Mud, stones, steep slopes, dense vegetation, and narrow paths could reduce their value. Armies therefore needed knowledge of ground, weather, routes, and water. A powerful vehicle in one landscape could become a burden in another. The chariot did not conquer by itself. It required planning, coordination, and a society able to bring the right animals, people, and supplies together at the right time. This made it expensive, and expense helped preserve its connection with elites. Those who controlled large herds and specialist labor could display mobility that ordinary households could not easily reproduce. Yet the public image of power often separated the driver and warrior from the many lives that sustained them. The horse became visible as a symbol, while the work of feeding and caring for it remained mostly unseen. Human civilizations would repeat this pattern long after chariots faded. Roads, cavalry, postal systems, farms, cities, and empires all depended on animal bodies supported by networks of labor. The origin of horsepower was never only the moment when a person moved faster. It was the moment when communities accepted the continuing cost of making that speed available again and again. Every rapid arrival was balanced by hours of feeding, waiting, cleaning, repairing, and recovery. Every display of controlled motion rested on living creatures that could tire, fear, suffer, and fail. The chariot revealed a new form of social power because it concentrated the work of many into the movement of a few. It also revealed the deeper bargain that would follow horses through history, for whenever humans borrowed speed from another species, They had to build a world around keeping that borrowed strength alive. Even victory carried a maintenance cost, and even prestige depended on manure removed before dawn, damaged harness replaced in silence, and animals returned slowly to rest. The polished wheel, seen by a crowd, was therefore only the visible edge of a much larger arrangement, one that joined land, labour, craft, discipline, and animal life into a temporary burst of controlled speed. Beneath every celebrated journey stood a quieter civilization whose daily work made movement possible for generations. The rider did not simply replace the chariot by climbing onto a horse. Direct riding demanded a different kind of balance, communication, and control. In a chariot, the driver stood behind a team and guided movement through reins, harness, wheels, and the structure of the vehicle. On horseback, the human body rested directly above a living spine, and every shift of weight could affect the animal beneath it. The rider had to remain stable while the horse accelerated, turned, stopped, crossed uneven ground, or reacted to fear. The horse had to accept pressure around its head and body, the movement of legs against its sides, and the changing balance of a person on its back. These demands made mounted travel more than a simpler version of horse transport. It was a learned coordination between two bodies that moved differently but had to act as one. Early riders probably used varied equipment, much of it made from leather, felt, wood, or plant fibres that rarely survives. Saddles, when they became more developed, helped distribute pressure and improve stability, but the first riders did not possess every technology later associated with cavalry. Stirrups appeared much later than the beginnings of mounted riding, and many effective riders learned to remain secure through posture, gripping, balance, and long practice. This matters because cavalry was not created by one object. A useful mounted force required suitable horses, experienced riders, methods of communication, weapons that could be handled while moving, and a social system able to train both humans and animals repeatedly. The beginning of human partnership with horses had depended on observing fear and building routine. Mounted riding intensified that dependence. A frightened horse could turn suddenly, refuse an obstacle, collide with another animal, or throw its rider. A tense rider could increase confusion through inconsistent pressure. Speed magnified every mistake. Before mounted warriors could influence battles, generations of herders and travellers had to learn how to remain on a moving horse without exhausting or injuring it. Riding may have first served practical tasks such as watching livestock, reaching distant grazing areas, carrying messages, or moving between camps. Formal cavalry appeared only when states and communities organized mounted people into disciplined groups with shared expectations. This transition altered the use of space. A rider was less restricted than a wheeled vehicle by narrow paths, broken ground, or the need for a constructed platform, although horses still faced limits in forests, marshes, mountains, heat, and poor pasture. Mounted people could scout ahead, follow dispersed herds, approach from several directions, and leave more quickly than troops on foot. They could also carry information between separated forces while events were still unfolding. Yet mobility did not guarantee victory. Horses needed water, forage, rest, and protection. Riders required training that could not be created immediately during a crisis. Large groups of mounted animals produced noise, dust, waste, and enormous demands on the surrounding landscape. A force could move rapidly for a time and then slow when animals weakened or supplies failed. The horse therefore expanded military possibilities without removing biology. Its body remained the foundation of every plan. The rise of the mounted rider also changed the human body. People had to develop balance, endurance, and habits suited to long hours in close contact with an animal. Falls, crushing injuries, damaged joints, and wounds from frightened horses were continuing risks. Archaeological evidence can sometimes suggest repeated riding through changes in human skeletons, but such traces are difficult to interpret and do not provide a perfect date for the first rider. The origin of mounted life remains a gradual history rather than a single proven event. What became clear over time was that riding separated movement from wheels. Human speed could now pass through landscapes where a chariot could not easily go, and the rider could dismount, lead the horse, remount, or change animals as conditions required. This flexibility would eventually help create new frontiers and new forms of power. The platform had disappeared, but the hidden system remained. Breeders, trainers, herders, craftsmen, grazing land, and generations of remembered skill still stood beneath every mounted figure. The grasslands of Eurasia created conditions in which mounted movement could become part of ordinary survival rather than an occasional display of wealth. Wide pastures supported herds that could move with changing seasons, while long distances between water, shelter, and neighbouring communities rewarded people who could travel quickly. Yet the steppe was never an empty corridor occupied by one simple kind of society. Pastoral groups differed in language, economy, political organisation, and the amount of time they spent moving. Some families travelled with livestock through seasonal territories, while others maintained settlements, cultivated crops, or lived near towns and frontier markets. Horses increased flexibility within these varied lives, but they did not erase dependence on sheep, cattle, goats, grain, metal, cloth, and goods produced beyond the grasslands. This dependence drew mobile and settled communities into long relationships that included trade, diplomacy, military service, tribute, marriage, raiding, and war. The border between them was not a permanent wall. It was a changing zone where animals, objects, skills, and people passed in both directions. Steppe herders could supply horses to agricultural states that lacked enough suitable pasture to breed large numbers of strong animals. Settled societies could provide grain, textiles, metalwork, weapons, luxury goods, and manufactured equipment. Each side possessed resources the other valued, and this exchange could continue even during periods of hostility. A raid might interrupt trade, while a treaty might restore it under new terms. A mounted group could threaten a frontier, yet individuals from similar communities might also serve as scouts, guards, messengers, or soldiers within the armies of settled rulers. Horse mobility, therefore, did not produce one fixed opposition between nomads and farmers. It created a field of negotiation shaped by ecology and political power. At the origin of this relationship stood the uneven geography of horse production. Large herds needed grazing, water, breeding knowledge, and room to move. Empires with dense farming populations could maintain stables and specialist breeding grounds, but they often remained connected to pastoral regions for additional horses. This gave steppe communities an important resource while also exposing them to pressure from states seeking to control frontier routes and supplies. Horses could move wealth across land, but they could also attract conquest. The animal that expanded freedom for one population might become the reason another authority tried to regulate its pastures. Mounted movement also changed the rhythm of contact. Traders and envoys could cross open country more quickly, carrying information between courts, camps, and towns. News of political change, prices, conflict, or available grazing could influence decisions far from its source. Raiding parties could travel beyond the range expected by people on foot, take livestock, and withdraw before a slower response arrived. Settled states answered with walls, patrols, alliances, payments, market controls, and their own mounted forces. Neither side controlled the relationship permanently. Strong steppe confederations could compel powerful states to negotiate, while divided pastoral groups could be drawn into the service of neighbouring empires. Across generations, the balance shifted repeatedly. These encounters also produced misunderstanding. Writers in settled courts often described mobile neighbours mainly when they appeared as enemies, while the ordinary work of herding, exchange, family life, and seasonal planning received less attention. Archaeology helps recover a more balanced picture, showing communities that were adaptive, internally diverse, and connected to towns as well as pastures. The deeper consequence was that the steppe and the settled world became parts of one historical system. Grain produced in a river valley could help support a frontier garrison whose horses came from distant grasslands. A metal object made in a town could enter a pastoral household hundreds of miles away. A rider born among herders could serve a ruler in a walled capital, then carry techniques, stories, and political expectations back toward the open country. Horses did not merely connect two separate worlds. They helped create the movement through which those worlds continually reshaped one another without ever becoming the same. A mounted army could appear swift, only because an entire state had learned to slow down and prepare. Horses needed years of growth before they could carry riders through demanding journeys, and every campaign consumed animals through exhaustion, injury, disease, hunger, and simple loss. A ruler who wanted reliable cavalry, therefore, needed more than brave riders. The state had to secure breeding stock, protect grazing land, organize seasonal movement, maintain stables, train handlers, collect fodder, inspect animals, and replace those no longer fit for service. These tasks reached into taxation, law, frontier policy, and the daily work of rural communities. In many regions, the strength of cavalry depended on landscapes far from the capital, where pasture was wide enough and local knowledge deep enough to sustain large herds. Governments could establish breeding centres, demand horses as tribute, purchase them from pastoral neighbours, or reward communities that supplied animals for military use. None of these arrangements was simple. A horse suitable for farm work was not always suited to long-distance riding, and an animal impressive in appearance could still lack endurance, sound feet, or a manageable temperament. Selection, therefore, required experienced people who could judge bodies, movement, age, and behaviour. The origins of human reliance on horses had begun with close observation of wild herds, and that ancient skill remained hidden inside imperial administration. Officials might count animals and record deliveries, but someone still had to recognise whether a horse was healthy, frightened, injured, or too young for the work expected of it. The larger the state, the harder this knowledge became to coordinate across distance. Moving horses toward a frontier required routes with water and grazing. Keeping them near a city demanded stored feed and constant cleaning. Concentrating too many animals in one place increased pressure on land and could make disease easier to spread. Armies therefore needed chains of supply, rather than one permanent reserve. Replacement mounts had to exist behind the forces already in motion. Messengers and scouts needed fresh animals at intervals. Riders often required more than one horse if speed had to be maintained over long distances, because changing mounts protected each animal from complete exhaustion. The visible cavalryman was only the moving edge of a broad system of breeders, herders, stable workers, veterinarians or other experienced healers, smiths, leather workers, officials, and transport labourers. Political power grew around the ability to coordinate these people. A state that controlled pasture and horse markets could influence neighbouring communities, while a state cut off from suitable animals might struggle to defend wide borders. This dependence shaped diplomacy. Rulers negotiated for access to herds, exchanged gifts of prized horses, hired mounted peoples, and sometimes fought to control the regions where horses could be raised. The horse became both a military resource and a political language. Sending animals could signal alliance, submission, respect, or calculated advantage. Refusing them could weaken an agreement before any army moved. Yet supply remained fragile. Drought could reduce grazing, severe winters could kill animals, conflict could interrupt trade, and poor management could damage a breeding population for years. Human plans were repeatedly forced back into the biological pace of reproduction. No decree could make a foal mature overnight. No treasury could immediately restore a lost herd. This limit connected empires to time as deeply as roads connected them to space. Decisions made in one generation affected the number and quality of horses available to the next. States that invested in breeding and training could build durable mounted forces, while those that consumed animals faster than they replaced them risked sudden weakness. The horse therefore rewired political organization by making mobility depend on long preparation. Speed at the frontier began in quiet pastures, careful breeding, stored fodder, and knowledge preserved among people whose work was rarely celebrated. An empire could command riders to move, but only if land, labour, memory, and animal life had already been arranged to make that command possible. Long after horses had become symbols of warriors and rulers, their quieter power entered fields, roads, workshops, and markets. A horse could pull more weight than a person could carry, but this advantage did not appear simply because the animal was strong. Useful traction depended on matching the horse to the load, the harness, the vehicle, the ground, and the pace of work. A poorly fitted system could waste energy, restrict breathing, injure the shoulders, or make the animal resist. A well-managed system converted muscle into repeated movement, allowing grain, timber, stone, water, tools, and people to travel farther with less strain on human backs. This changed the scale of ordinary labour. A household no longer had to measure every task only by what one or two people could lift. Carts could bring larger quantities from fields to storage places. Goods could reach markets beyond the nearest settlement. Heavy materials could be moved toward construction sites, mills, docks, and towns. None of this removed work. It redistributed work across human bodies, animal bodies, and equipment. Someone still had to load the cart, guide the horse, maintain the wheels, repair straps, prepare feed, and judge when the animal needed rest. The visible movement of goods concealed a daily working relationship built from care and repetition. At the beginning of human life, carrying capacity had shaped where people could live and how much they could move. Tools, food, fuel, and children all had to be supported by muscle. Horse traction altered that ancient calculation. A journey that once required many carriers could sometimes be completed by fewer people with an animal and vehicle. This could free human labour for other tasks, but it could also increase expectations. When more weight became movable, societies often chose to move more. Larger harvests had to be transported, more building material could be demanded, longer routes became economically useful. The horse reduced one burden while helping create new systems of production that required constant movement. Its value also varied by environment. Open roads and firm ground favoured wheeled transport, while steep slopes, deep mud, dense forests, sand and narrow paths could limit it. In some places, oxen or other animals remained better suited to heavy, slow work. Horses were often faster, but they needed suitable feed and careful management. Their advantages depended on local ecology, available crops, road conditions, and the knowledge of those who worked with them. There was no universal replacement of one animal by another. Different societies combined human strength. Horses, cattle, donkeys, mules, and water transport according to need. What horses added was a particular balance of speed, strength, and responsiveness. They could help connect farm and market, village and town, workshop and customer. As these connections strengthened, economic life became less confined to the immediate surroundings of production. A farmer could send goods farther before spoilage. A craft worker could receive materials from beyond the local area. A town could draw food and fuel from a wider countryside. The horse entered the circulation that allowed settlements to grow beyond what nearby hands alone could sustain. Yet, every increase in circulation created dependence. If animals became sick, fodder failed, roads were blocked, or harness broke, movement slowed. Human communities had extended themselves through another species, and that extension remained vulnerable to weather, disease, injury, and care. The horse did not abolish physical limits. It moved those limits outward, making a larger economy possible while tying that economy to the daily health of living bodies. Behind every loaded cart stood pasture, grain, water, shelter, and human attention. The animal that seemed to save effort also required effort before dawn and after arrival. In this way, horsepower entered civilization not as a sudden escape from labour, but as a new arrangement of labour. Human communities gained reach by accepting responsibility for another body, and movement entered a network of dependence in human life. A horse could possess great strength and still waste much of it if the equipment around its body was poorly designed. Human communities therefore had to do more than breed powerful animals. They had to learn how pressure travelled through leather, wood, rope, metal, wheels, hooves, and road surfaces. A strap placed too high could restrict breathing. A load attached at the wrong angle could pull against the neck instead of the shoulders. A rough edge could produce a wound that worsened with every step. The useful energy of the horse depended on equipment that allowed the animal to push forward without fighting its own harness. This knowledge accumulated slowly and did not develop in the same form everywhere. Different societies adapted bridles, collars, breast straps, traces, yokes, saddles, and carts to local animals, materials, climates, and kinds of work. No device made horse traction perfect, and historians have cautioned against simple stories in which one invention suddenly transformed an entire continent. What mattered was the gradual improvement of a complete working arrangement. The harness connected muscle to the vehicle, but the vehicle also had to fit the ground. Heavy wheels could carry large loads yet sink into mud. Narrow wheels could cut deeply into soft soil. Weak axles failed under repeated shocks, while badly maintained roads increased resistance and exhausted animals more quickly. A cart that moved easily on a firm, level route might become nearly useless on a steep path. a flooded track, or a street broken by stones and ruts. Horsepower was therefore also created by the landscape humans prepared beneath the hoof. Roads, bridges, drainage, gates, turning spaces, and places to rest all determined how much work an animal could perform. At the beginning of human movement, paths had followed feet, water, game, and memory. Once loaded vehicles became common, routes also had to answer the width and weight of wheels. Communities repaired surfaces, cleared obstacles, and sometimes redirected movement toward crossings that could support animals and carts. These changes made the horse increasingly present even when no horse was visible. The shape of a road, the position of a market, and the spacing of stopping places could all reflect the needs of animal transport. Hoof care formed another quiet boundary between strength and usefulness. A hoof grows and wears, responding to moisture, ground, workload, and the condition of the animal. Horses moving regularly over hard, rough, or unfamiliar surfaces could suffer excessive wear, cracks, bruising, or lameness. Trimming and, in many settings, protective shoeing helped some working animals remain sound, although practices differed widely through time and place. A shoe could not repair poor feeding, careless loading, or endless work. It was one element within a larger system of care. Skilled farriers and other experienced workers had to judge each hoof, shape material, attach protection when appropriate, and notice problems before they disabled the animal. Their labour connected ancient knowledge of living bodies to the growing demands of roads and cities. As transport networks expanded, equipment became a form of stored knowledge. A well-shaped collar preserved lessons learned from earlier injuries. A balanced cart preserved understanding of weight. A maintained road preserved the labour of people who knew that every rut drew energy from the horse. None of these improvements removed biological limits. Animals still needed water, food, rest, and recovery. And greater efficiency often encouraged people to demand heavier loads or longer journeys. The history of horsepower was therefore not a steady escape from effort. It was a continuing negotiation between what societies wished to move and what a living body could safely provide. Harness, hoof protection, wheels, and roads did not create energy. They reduced the amount lost before that energy reached its purpose. Through these quiet technologies, human beings learned to guide strength beyond the body of the horse and into the wider structure of civilization. A road was no longer merely a path between places. It became a prepared surface through which animal strength entered economic life. Before engines filled streets with noise, much of everyday movement depended on living animals whose needs shaped the economy around them. Horses carried passengers, pulled carts, delivered food, moved building materials, hauled refuse, and connected farms with towns. Their labour could make a city appear efficient, yet every journey began somewhere quieter, in a stable, a yard, a pasture, or a field where feed was grown. The working horse had to eat whether business was busy or slow. It needed water, bedding, shelter, grooming, rest, and attention to illness or injury. Urban movement therefore depended on rural land. Grain, hay, and straw flowed toward towns so that horses could move people and goods in the opposite direction. This exchange joined city streets to distant fields through a constant circulation of food, labour, and animal energy. The horse stood inside the economy not only as a vehicle, but also as a consumer whose body required support every day. Stables occupied valuable space near homes, markets, workshops, inns, military buildings, and transport yards. Their location influenced where carts waited, where travellers stopped, and how goods entered crowded streets. Stable workers fed animals before dawn, cleaned stalls, carried water, checked harness, and watched for signs of weakness. Farriers trimmed hooves and fitted protection when necessary. Wheelwrights repaired wheels. Leather workers made and mended straps. Drivers learned routes, traffic, weather, and the limits of individual animals. Farmers and merchants planned loads according to road conditions and available teams. A single cart moving through a town represented the coordination of many occupations, most of them invisible to the person receiving the delivery. This arrangement grew from the oldest human dependence on careful observation. Long before cities existed, people survived by noticing tracks, hunger, movement, and changing seasons. In horse-powered economies, the same attention became specialised work. A handler had to know whether an animal was merely unwilling, truly frightened, overheated, lame, or exhausted. Misjudgment could injure the horse, damage goods, block a road, or endanger people nearby. Economic reliability therefore rested on knowledge of living bodies, not only on prices and schedules. Cities also had to manage what horses left behind. Large populations of working animals produced great quantities of manure, urine, worn bedding, and dead animals. Waste could create odor, attract insects, contaminate water, and make streets difficult to use if removal failed. Yet manure also had value as fertilizer and could be collected, sold, and returned to agricultural land. The horse connected city and countryside even through waste, completing a material cycle that modern observers can easily overlook. Nothing about this system was clean or effortless. It required constant removal, storage, transport, and regulation. The apparent convenience of animal transport rested on labour, performed before and after every visible journey. Dependence also created vulnerability. Poor harvests could raise feed prices. Drought could weaken animals. Disease could reduce available teams. Severe weather could interrupt roads and deliveries. A city that relied on horses for food distribution, construction, public transport, and sanitation could slow when the animals supporting those functions were unavailable. The human body had once set the scale of movement, but society had extended that scale through another species and had inherited its needs. Horsepower made larger markets and denser settlements more workable, while binding them to pasture, grain, water, skilled care, and daily cleaning. Beneath the flow of commerce stood a living infrastructure, breathing, eating, tiring, and waiting in the stable until civilization called it into motion again. Ownership influenced social position because access to teams could determine who reached markets, moved harvests, or accepted distant work. Small operators might rent animals, share them, or depend on wealthier owners, while institutions maintained fleets for regular service. The horse, therefore, distributed opportunity unevenly. It reduced some distances, but the cost of feeding and maintaining it placed faster movement within systems of property, credit, employment, and authority that shaped who benefited from its strength. Before messages could move through wires or radio waves, information travelled inside human memory, on written surfaces, and through the bodies of messengers. A person walking between settlements could carry a warning, an order, a promise, or a report, but the meaning of that information weakened as time passed. A flood might change course, an army might move, a ruler might die, or a market price might shift before the message arrived. Horse travel altered this delay. A mounted messenger could cover greater distances within the same span of daylight, change direction quickly, and return with an answer sooner than a person on foot. The horse did not make communication immediate, and weather, terrain, injury, and poor roads could still interrupt a journey. What changed was the amount of distance that information could cross before it became too old to guide action. This gave governments, merchants, military forces, and distant families new ways to remain connected. A warning sent from a frontier could reach a centre of authority while there was still time to prepare. Instructions could travel outward before local conditions changed completely. News about grazing, harvests, disease, conflict, or available goods could influence decisions far beyond the place where it began. At the origin of human society, knowledge had moved through face-to-face contact, repeated journeys, and stories carried by people whose bodies set the speed of communication. The horse extended that ancient human system without replacing it. A messenger still had to understand the route, remember spoken details, protect written material, and judge whom to trust. Speed mattered only when information remained accurate enough to be useful. A fast, false report could create confusion more quickly than a slow one. This made reliable messengers valuable, because the horse increased the reach of both truth and error. Political authority also changed when commands could travel farther. A ruler did not need to be physically present in every town, garrison, or estate if trusted riders could carry instructions and return with reports. This did not produce perfect control. Local officials could delay, alter, misunderstand, or ignore messages, while distant communities might respond according to their own interests. Even so, mounted communication allowed larger territories to be imagined as connected fields of decision. Places separated by mountains, plains, or long roads could be drawn into the same sequence of order and reply. The horse therefore helped organize time as well as space. A message sent in the morning could shape events elsewhere before nightfall if the distance and route allowed it. Decisions became linked across locations that had once acted with longer periods of uncertainty. Military forces used this advantage to coordinate movement, request supplies, report threats, and redirect troops. Merchants used it to learn where goods were needed, where roads were unsafe, and where prices had changed. Families and communities used riders to carry news of births, deaths, illness, marriage, and return. The emotional world of distance shifted when absence could be interrupted by information. Yet every message still depended on a living animal. A horse could tire, stumble, lose a shoe, become frightened, or fall ill. The rider needed food, water, shelter, and protection. Written documents could be damaged, stolen, or read by the wrong person. Communication remained vulnerable because it moved through bodies and landscapes rather than through an abstract network. This vulnerability encouraged the development of routes, stopping places, fresh mounts, guards, records, and recognized messengers. The faster information became, the more organization was needed to preserve that speed. A lone rider could carry one urgent report, but a society that wanted regular communication had to build a dependable chain. Roads had to be known, horses kept ready, and people prepared to receive and forward what arrived. The horse did not simply help messages travel, it encouraged institutions to treat communication as a continuous service rather than an occasional journey. In that transformation, human memory began to operate across larger distances, supported by hooves, roads, and repeated exchanges that made faraway events present before they were over. A single horse could carry a messenger quickly, but no animal could maintain its highest pace across an entire kingdom. The body that made speed possible also imposed the limit. Muscles tired, hooves wore, breathing deepened, and the need for water and rest returned regardless of political urgency. Societies that wanted information to travel farther had to stop thinking of speed as the achievement of one rider and begin treating it as a sequence. Along important routes, fresh horses could be kept at prepared stopping places. A messenger arriving on a tired mount could transfer a document, change animals, and continue before the first horse had recovered. In some systems, the rider continued with a new mount. In others, the message passed to another person who knew the next stretch of road. The result was a chain in which no horse crossed the whole distance, yet the information moved through the entire network. This arrangement transformed distance into a series of manageable intervals. Each station needed animals, fodder, water, shelter, workers, records, and a method for identifying travelers authorized to use the service. Roads had to remain recognizable, bridges and crossings needed attention, and officials had to know when horses were missing, sick, or exhausted. A broken link could slow everything beyond it. The speed celebrated at a capital therefore depended on ordinary labor, performed far away by stable workers, herders, innkeepers, guards, messengers, and local communities required to support the route. At the beginning of human movement, a path existed because feet repeatedly crossed the same ground. Relay networks gave paths another purpose. They became measured corridors in which distance was divided according to the needs of animals and institutions. The location of water, grazing, settlements, and difficult terrain influenced where stations could function. A straight line on a map might be less useful than a longer road with dependable supplies. Geography still ruled movement, but organization learned to negotiate with it. Relay systems also changed the meaning of authority. A government able to send orders regularly could remain involved in distant provinces without placing the ruler there. Reports could return through the same chain, allowing centers of power to receive news about taxes, military threats, local disputes, harvests, or the conduct of officials. This did not guarantee honesty or obedience. Messages could be delayed, copied incorrectly, intercepted, or altered, and local authorities still possessed knowledge that distant rulers lacked. Yet the network reduced the silence that had once separated decisions from their consequences. It made repeated communication possible across territories too large for one traveller to cross quickly. Merchants and private travellers often benefited from roads, inns, and security created around official routes. although access to fresh mounts could remain restricted or expensive. The network therefore produced unequal speed. Those recognized by the state, military, or wealthy institutions could move information faster than people who depended on their own animals or feet. Control over communication became another form of power, because the first reliable report could influence markets, alliances, defenses, and public expectations. Even rumor could travel along the same roads, following travelers who carried fragments of what they had heard. The horse did not decide which message deserved speed. Human institutions made that choice by deciding who received animals' protection and passage. Schedules, seals, and written permissions helped protect this fragile sequence from confusion and misuse. Beneath this system remained the ancient biological bargain between two species. Every rapid transfer required horses to be waiting, fed, trained, and healthy before the messenger arrived. The network seemed to overcome fatigue only because fatigue was distributed among many bodies. No animal escaped its limits. Instead, society arranged those limits in sequence, turning rest for one horse into movement for another. Through relay stations, civilization learned that speed could be manufactured from coordination. Distance was not conquered by endless motion, but divided, supported, and passed forward from hoof to hoof. The horse carried goods across distance, but it also travelled as a valuable good in its own right. A trained animal represented years of feeding, breeding, handling, and risk, so its price could reflect much more than muscle. Communities exchanged horses for grain, metal, cloth, weapons, livestock, and political favour. Rulers presented them as gifts, merchants moved them between regions, and armies sought them through purchase, tribute, or capture. This made the horse embedded in trade before it ever pulled a merchant's cart. Its living body linked grasslands where large herds could be raised with farming regions, towns, and courts that needed movement, but could not always produce enough suitable animals. The exchange depended on ecology. A horse could not be stored like metal or grain. It ate during the journey, needed water, lost condition under stress, and could become injured or ill before reaching a buyer. Traders had to understand routes not only as distances between markets, but as chains of pasture, wells, river crossings, shelter, and relative safety. A road that served human travellers might still be poor for a herd if grazing was scarce. Seasons mattered because heat, snow, drought, insects, and mud changed the condition of animals and the cost of moving them. Trade therefore followed the biological calendar of the horse as well as the political calendar of states. At the beginning of the human relationship with horses, people learned to read movement, hunger, and fear. Long-distance exchange transformed that intimate knowledge into commercial judgment. Buyers examined age, teeth, legs, hooves, breathing, behavior, and soundness. Sellers understood that an animal's appearance could hide weakness, while experienced handlers watched how it moved and responded under pressure. Trust became essential because value could decline quickly after a sale. Written agreements, witnesses, reputations, and official inspections developed in many settings to reduce uncertainty, but no system removed it completely. A horse remained a living purchase whose future usefulness could never be guaranteed. Movement also spread knowledge. Along with animals came methods of breeding, riding, harnessing, healing, feeding, and training. A community receiving unfamiliar horses might adapt its equipment or change its expectations about speed, endurance, and work. Craftspeople learned new forms of saddles, bridles, bits, carts, and protective gear. Words and techniques crossed borders with handlers who knew the animals best. The trade in horses was therefore also a trade in practical memory. It connected people who might never share the same language or political loyalty, yet who recognized similar signs of fatigue, fear, injury, and readiness. These networks could enrich frontier communities, but they also created dependence. A state that relied on imported horses became vulnerable to closed routes, conflict, disease, or the refusal of suppliers. Pastoral groups could gain influence because they controlled breeding landscapes and skilled labor, while powerful states could pressure them through taxes, market rules, military force, or demands for tribute. The horse linked economies, but it did not make the relationship equal. Wealth and authority shaped who could move animals safely and who carried the risks of loss. Markets built around this traffic became meeting places where rumours, prices, alliances and dangers were compared. Even people who never owned a horse could feel its influence through changing costs, military demands, available work, and the arrival of strangers from territories once thought remote nearby. Over time, repeated routes formed corridors through which goods, news, people, and political expectations travelled together. A horse sold at one frontier might later carry a messenger, pull a load, enter a breeding herd, or serve in war far from the grassland where it was born. Its movement joined distant human decisions into one chain. Civilization became wider not because every region produced the same things, but because living networks allowed differences to be exchanged. The horse stood at the center of that process, consuming the landscape as it moved and carrying the value of one world into another. Long before horses returned to the Americas with European colonization, their deeper history had already unfolded there across an immense span of evolutionary time. The family to which modern horses belong developed in North America, where changing climates and landscapes shaped many forms of equids. Some were small and adapted to wooded environments, while later forms included larger grazing animals suited to more open country. Over generations too numerous to observe directly, teeth changed with diet, limbs changed with movement, and populations responded to grasslands that expanded or contracted. This was not a straight march toward the modern horse. Evolution produced branches, experiments, migrations and extinctions, leaving a fossil record filled with animals that shared features with horses, asses, and zebras without fitting neatly into the categories familiar today. Some equid populations crossed between North America and Eurasia when northern land connections and suitable environments allowed movement. Their descendants continued beyond the Americas, preserving lineages that would much later become connected with domestication. Within North and South America, however, native horses remained part of Ice Age ecosystems alongside large grazers, predators, and human communities entering landscapes already shaped by long ecological histories. People encountered horses first as wild animals rather than transport. Archaeological evidence shows that horses were sometimes hunted, but it does not support a simple picture in which one human action alone explains their disappearance. Near the end of the Pleistocene, climates shifted rapidly, vegetation changed, habitats were reorganized, and many large animals declined or vanished. Human populations were also spreading through the continents, using different environments and hunting a range of species. Researchers continue to debate how these pressures interacted. In some regions, environmental change may have reduced the open grazing conditions that supported horse populations. In others, hunting may have added pressure to animals already facing unstable food, water, and breeding conditions. Disease, population fragmentation, and local ecological differences have also been considered, but the surviving evidence does not permit one universal explanation. The disappearance was probably not a single event occurring everywhere at the same moment. Fossils and ancient environmental traces suggest that some populations persisted longer in certain northern areas than older chronologies once indicated. Even so, by the early Holocene, horses were absent from the American continents. This created one of the quietest breaks in the history of human mobility. The land where equids had evolved no longer contained living horses, while related populations survived across Eurasia. Indigenous societies in the Americas continued to develop complex agriculture, trade, cities, political systems, and long-distance networks without them. This fact matters because it prevents the horse from being treated as a necessary requirement for civilization. Human communities built sophisticated worlds through walking, watercraft, dogs, human carrying systems, and locally adapted forms of transport and exchange. The later return of the horse would transform many regions, but it entered societies that already possessed deep knowledge, established roots, and their own political histories. At the origin of the horse, North America had been a place of evolutionary creation. After the Ice Age extinction, it became a place of absence. Grasslands remained, people continued to move, and other grazing animals occupied parts of the ecological space. Yet the sound and movement of native horse herds disappeared for thousands of years. No written memory preserved that loss, and later generations could not have known the full fossil history beneath their feet. The emptiness was therefore geological rather than remembered. For thousands of years, no rider, farmer, messenger, or army in the Americas could draw upon equine speed. Distances were organized through other bodies, technologies, waterways, and social systems, proving again that human ingenuity did not wait for the horse to return. When domestic horses eventually crossed the Atlantic, they were not entering a continent that had never known their kind. They were returning in altered form, carrying human breeding, equipment, warfare, trade, and colonial power into the ancient homeland of their distant ancestors. When domestic horses crossed the Atlantic, they returned to the hemisphere of their distant evolutionary origin, carrying a history that had been formed elsewhere. They arrived with saddles, bridles, metal weapons, breeding practices, and human institutions already organized around equine movement. Horses were brought into the Caribbean during the first decades of European colonization, and then accompanied Spanish expeditions, settlements, ranches, and military campaigns across parts of the mainland. Their return was therefore not a neutral biological event. It occurred within conquest, forced labor, disease, land seizure, religious expansion, and the disruption of existing political worlds. Mounted soldiers possessed an advantage in speed, height, and mobility, especially during early encounters with communities that had never seen mounted warfare. The horse could carry a fighter rapidly toward or away from danger, support scouting across unfamiliar ground, and help move messages and supplies between separated groups. Yet it would be misleading to imagine that horses alone defeated large indigenous societies. European campaigns depended on alliances with indigenous peoples, existing rivalries, weapons, maritime supply, epidemic disease, political decisions, and local knowledge. Horses were one element within a much larger and unequal process. Their importance came from how they changed the timing and reach of action. A mounted force could search farther, pursue longer, and appear sooner than people expecting movement at the speed of walking. The animal also gave colonial authorities a visible symbol of power. A rider seated above people on foot could seem physically elevated, while the sound and movement of several horses could create confusion in crowded or unfamiliar settings. That first imbalance did not remain permanent. Indigenous observers learned quickly that horse and rider were separate living bodies, each with limits. Horses could be frightened, injured, captured, traded, or trained. Their need for grass, water, rest, and human care made them powerful but never invulnerable. Colonial settlements required pastures, corrals, stable workers, herders, craftsmen, and routes along which animals could be moved. As horse populations grew, some escaped or were lost, while others entered indigenous hands through exchange, labor, capture, and changing political relationships. The history of their spread cannot be reduced to one moment when a colonial monopoly suddenly ended. It unfolded unevenly across regions, and different communities encountered horses under different conditions. Some lived near missions, ranches, towns, or military frontiers where animals were present early. Others remained distant from horse populations for generations. Geography mattered. Grasslands could support expanding herds, while forests, deserts without dependable water, tropical disease environments, and mountainous terrain placed different limits on their use. At the origin of human civilization, movement had been shaped by the body and the landscape. In the colonial Americas, the same rule remained true, even when political power tried to force movement into new forms. Horses helped Europeans explore routes, patrol territory, transport goods, manage livestock, and connect settlements, but the animals did not make the continent easily controllable. Distances remained enormous, resistance continued, and colonial governments often depended on indigenous guides, translators, allies, and local producers. Mounted movement could extend authority, yet it could also carry people beyond the secure reach of that authority. The horse therefore created possibilities that no single group could permanently own. Once animals reproduced outside tightly controlled herds, their future became harder to contain. Skills also moved with them. People learned to catch, ride, breed, exchange, and care for horses, adapting equipment and methods to local needs rather than merely copying European practices. The later transformation of indigenous mobility grew from conditions created during this colonial return. An animal introduced as an instrument of invasion began to enter landscapes and relationships that colonizers could not fully direct. The horse carried colonial power inland, but it also carried the possibility that speed, once released into a living population, might be claimed by people whom that power intended to control. Its return to the Americas was therefore both a tool of conquest and the beginning of a much less predictable redistribution of movement. The spread of horses among indigenous peoples was not a passive continuation of European expansion. It became a process of adaptation, choice, and cultural change directed by many different communities. Horses entered indigenous hands through trade, capture, escape, employment on colonial ranches, diplomatic exchange, and the gradual movement of herds across broad regions. The timing differed greatly from place to place, and no single story can represent the whole continent. Some communities adopted horses quickly because open grasslands, established trade routes, and mobile hunting traditions made them useful. Others used them only in limited ways, delayed adoption, or lived in environments where horses offered fewer advantages. The animal did not arrive as a complete system with one fixed meaning. People decided how it would fit into existing economies, kinship networks, warfare, ceremony, and daily movement. Knowledge also had to be built locally. Riders learned which animals were suited to long travel, hunting, carrying loads, or conflict. Breeders selected mares and stallions according to temperament, endurance, color, size, and survival under regional conditions. Saddles, bridles, ropes, and methods of handling were modified with available materials and inherited skills. The result was not a simple imitation of Spanish horsemanship. It was the creation of new equestrian traditions rooted in indigenous experience. On the grasslands, horses could increase the range of bison hunting, reduce the time needed to move camps, and allow more goods to travel with families. They could strengthen trade by connecting distant communities and carrying hides, food, tools, and people across routes that had existed long before the horse returned. Yet these benefits also introduced new demands. Herds required pasture, water, protection, and labor. Winter storms, drought, disease, theft, and conflict could destroy years of careful breeding. Families with more horses could move and trade differently from those with few or none, creating new forms of inequality within some societies. The horse therefore expanded opportunity without distributing it evenly. Political relationships also changed. Mounted groups could patrol wider territories, respond quickly to threats, raid distant enemies, and defend access to hunting grounds or trade routes. Alliances became increasingly important because horse wealth could be gained, shared, exchanged, or lost through conflict. Some communities expanded their influence, while others faced displacement, pressure, or dependence. These changes were never caused by horses alone. Epidemics, colonial settlement, firearms, commercial hunting, environmental change, and state violence all shaped the same history. The horse altered how quickly people could act within those pressures, but it did not determine every outcome. At the origin of human mobility, distance had been limited by muscle, memory, and the needs of the group. Indigenous horse cultures demonstrated again that an animal's power became historically important only when people organized knowledge around it. Children learned to ride, handlers learned to calm and train animals, and families developed ways to recognize ownership, value, and responsibility. Horses entered oral traditions, social identity, exchange, and ceremony in forms that varied widely. Their significance could be practical, political, spiritual, or all three, but it must not be reduced to a single romantic image of freedom on the plains. For many communities, horses were also work, risk, wealth, grief, and obligation. Their presence reshaped relations with neighboring peoples and with colonial authorities, who increasingly understood that indigenous control of horses could resist attempts at domination. Mounted communities could move beyond fixed settlements, protect trade, and challenge military forces across large territories. In response, colonial and later national governments often sought to restrict movement, seize animals, destroy herds, or confine people to smaller areas. This reveals the deeper political meaning of the horse in the Americas. An animal first reintroduced through conquest became a source of mobility that could not remain under colonial control. Indigenous peoples did not merely receive the horse, they transformed it into many distinct systems of life. In doing so, they showed that technology is never only the object or animal being used. It is the knowledge, relationships, values, and choices that determine what that power becomes across generations. The freedom associated with the horse was never distributed equally. For some people, riding meant reaching distant relatives, escaping danger, finding new pasture, carrying goods, or moving through the world with a speed that human legs could not provide. From land. For others, the same speed arrived as invasion. Its body became part of social taxation, gave movement to some while limiting the movement of others. This contradiction appeared wherever access to horses, training, pasture and equipment was concentrated in a small part of society. A mounted official could cross a district quickly, but the farmers who supplied fodder might still travel on foot. A cavalry force could defend a frontier, yet it could also collect tribute, suppress resistance, or carry violence into places that distance had once protected. The animal that widened the horizon could also narrow the choices of people who stood in its path. At the beginning of the human relationship with horses, mobility had grown from cooperation between species. Over time, that cooperation became absorbed into institutions of power. States counted horses, assigned riders, demanded animals from rural communities, and regulated who could own or use them. Wealthy households could maintain stables and replacement mounts, while poorer families might depend on borrowed animals or have no access at all. Speed became a privilege supported by land, labor, and inherited resources. This inequality changed the meaning of distance. A person with a horse could reach a market sooner, carry news first, seek work farther away, or leave before danger closed the road. A person without one remained more exposed to delay. The difference could influence income, security, marriage, political influence, and survival. Yet horse ownership did not always mean comfort. Herding, feeding, training, and guarding animals demanded time, and a family could lose years of investment through disease, theft, drought, or war. The horse offered possibility, but it also created dependence. Violence made this dependence especially clear. Armies required horses not only for combat, but for transport, scouting, communication, and supply. When rulers demanded animals, food, or riders, the cost was often carried by communities far from the battlefield. Fields produced fodder instead of food for local use. Young men were taken into service. Craftspeople repaired equipment under pressure. Animals were driven beyond safe limits and discarded when injured. The celebrated movement of armies rested on quiet extraction from ordinary lives. Conquest also used horses to control space after fighting ended. Mounted patrols could watch roads, pursue fugitives, carry orders, and enforce boundaries across wide territories. People subjected to this power experienced the horse not as freedom, but as the sound of authority approaching. In systems of forced labor and colonial rule, mounted overseers and soldiers often held advantages over people denied comparable mobility. The height and speed of the rider became part of social domination. Still, the same animal could later support resistance, escape, or the rebuilding of autonomy when control shifted. This is why the history of horses cannot be told as a simple rise of progress. Every increase in mobility changed who could act, who had to wait, and who paid the cost. The horse expanded human reach, but human societies decided how that reach was used. It could carry aid or punishment, trade or plunder, reunion or displacement. Its power lay in movement, while its moral direction came from the institutions, choices, and inequalities surrounding it. To understand how horses rewired civilization, we must therefore look not only at how far they carried people, but at who was permitted to ride, who maintained the road, who supplied the feed, and who heard the hooves coming without any means to leave. A faster society was not automatically a fairer one. Sometimes it merely allowed existing authority to arrive sooner, extend farther, and remain present across landscapes that had previously offered distance as a form of protection. Ownership of horses often became a visible measure of position because keeping even one healthy animal required land, feed, shelter, equipment, time, and skilled care. A household with several horses controlled not only living bodies, but also access to movement, trade, hunting, communication, and protection. In many societies, this made the horse a form of wealth that could be displayed, inherited, exchanged, gifted, taxed, or taken in war. The meaning of ownership varied across places and periods, yet the pattern was familiar. Those who possessed reliable mounts could reach farther, arrive sooner, and maintain wider networks than those who travelled only on foot. Status therefore emerged not from the animal alone, but from the system required to sustain it. Pasture had to be secured, fodder stored, handlers trained, and young animals protected until they matured. The horse revealed how deeply social rank could be tied to control over time and distance. Breeding strengthened this connection because different tasks rewarded different qualities. Animals intended for long journeys needed endurance and sound feet. Those used for pulling required strength and a steady response to pressure. Hunting horses had to tolerate sudden movement and remain responsive in changing ground, while military animals needed training that reduced panic amid noise, crowding, and confusion. Ceremonial horses could be valued for appearance, colour, movement, or association with lineage and prestige. These preferences did not create fixed breeds in the modern sense at every early stage, and the evidence rarely allows precise claims about the intentions of ancient breeders. What can be said is that repeated human choices gradually shaped horse populations toward local needs. People kept certain animals for reproduction, exchanged valuable stock, and remembered which family lines produced useful temperaments or bodies. Over generations, this knowledge became embedded in social identity. Some communities became known for distinctive horses, and access to those animals could strengthen alliances or attract political pressure. A prize stallion or mare was more than an individual creature. It represented possible future offspring, future journeys, and future influence. Ownership, therefore, extended forward in time. The value of a horse was tied to what it might produce as well as what it could do in the present. This also created vulnerability, because disease, injury, theft, drought, or war could erase accumulated wealth quickly. A family rich in horses could lose status within a season if grazing failed or raiders took the herd. The animal that signaled security also required constant protection. At the origin of human society, possessions were limited by what people could carry, but horse ownership helped create wealth that moved, reproduced, and consumed resources while doing so. This living property could deepen inequality, yet it could also circulate through gifts, marriage agreements, payment, or shared use. Not every relationship followed strict private ownership, since herds might be managed by families, clans, institutions, or rulers, with rights divided among different people. One person could ride an animal, another could claim its offspring, and another could provide the pasture. These arrangements show that horse wealth was embedded in social obligations, rather than separated from them. Breeding, ownership, and status, therefore, formed one connected structure. The horse became a mirror of the society around it, revealing who controlled land, who inherited privilege, who performed care, and who could convert animal life into mobility. Beneath every admired mount stood generations of selection, feeding, teaching, and unequal access, making prestige appear as a rider, while its true foundation remained distributed among many hands and many seasons. The social meaning of colour and ancestry could also outlast practical usefulness, especially when courts, warrior groups, or wealthy families treated certain animals as signs of legitimacy. Paintings, burials, gifts, and written records sometimes preserve this symbolic value, although they usually represent elites more clearly than workers. Behind those images, countless less celebrated horses continued carrying harvests, children, messages, and tools, reminding us that prestige rested beside ordinary dependence. Civilization often remembered the rider, the carriage, the harvest, and the victory, but it rarely remembered the body that made those movements possible. Horses worked through heat, cold, mud, dust, hunger, noise, and fear, carrying loads that were chosen by people and following schedules they did not create. Their strength could make human labour appear lighter, yet the burden had not disappeared. It had shifted into another living frame. Muscles strained, joints absorbed repeated impact, skin rubbed beneath harness, lungs worked harder on steep roads, and hooves met stone, frozen ground, or deep ruts day after day. Careful owners and experienced handlers could reduce harm through rest, feeding, fitting equipment, and noticing injury early, but economic pressure, war, poverty, and urgency often pushed animals beyond safe limits. A horse that slowed could be whipped, sold, abandoned, or replaced, especially where its value was measured mainly by the work it could still perform. This did not happen everywhere in the same way, and human relationships with horses ranged from attentive partnership to severe exploitation, yet the possibility of suffering was built into every system that treated living strength as a dependable resource. At the beginning of the human relationship with horses, people had learned that fear, hunger, and fatigue could not be ignored without losing the animal. As cities, armies, farms, and transport networks grew, that intimate lesson became harder to preserve because the person demanding speed was often far from the stable, pasture, or road where the cost was paid. Institutions could count deliveries, journeys, and military units, but they could not easily record every sore back, damaged mouth, swollen leg, or exhausted breath. The animal disappeared inside the calculation, becoming horsepower, transport capacity, or military supply rather than a body with limits. Age also shaped this hidden economy. Young horses required years of care before difficult work, while older animals gradually lost strength, speed, or soundness. Societies had to decide whether to rest, reassign, sell, slaughter, or continue using them, and these choices reflected both material conditions and moral values. Illness could spread through crowded stables or moving armies, while poor feed weakened resistance and delayed recovery. Wounds from harness, falls, collisions, and heavy pulling could turn a valuable animal into a burden for people already living close to scarcity. Because horses reproduced slowly and matured gradually, careless use could damage not only individuals but future herds. The cost of a campaign or transport boom might therefore appear years later in weakened breeding populations and shortages of healthy animals. This returned civilization to the same biological truth present before domestication. No human command could erase the pace of growth, healing, reproduction, and death. The horse expanded human time and distance only because its own time was consumed in the process. Every mile shortened for a traveller was experienced as effort inside another body. Every load removed from human shoulders pressed somewhere else through collar, saddle, traces, muscle, and bone. Recognizing this does not require imagining the horse as a silent human or assigning it thoughts that cannot be known. It requires only accepting that animals feel pain, fatigue, stress, and relief, and that historical systems were built around those realities whether records acknowledge them or not. The deeper history of horsepower is therefore also a history of responsibility. Human societies gain movement by entering a relationship of dependence with a vulnerable species, and the quality of that relationship revealed what those societies considered acceptable when power was useful. But suffering remained mostly unseen. Beneath roads, markets, empires, and fields stood countless animals whose lives were shortened, protected, neglected, valued, or exhausted according to human decisions. Its silence allowed achievement to be celebrated, while the strain beneath that achievement remained easy for later generations to overlook or romanticize. The horse did not merely carry civilization forward, it carried a portion of civilization's physical cost within its own body. For thousands of years, the movement of cities, farms, armies, and messages depended on horses. Yet within a relatively short span of modern history, that dependence began to disappear. Railways carried heavier loads across greater distances, steamships crossed oceans without fodder, tractors entered fields, and motor vehicles moved through streets without needing rest, water, or stable space. The change did not happen everywhere at once, and horses remained essential in many regions long after machines appeared, but the direction was clear. Societies were learning to replace living muscle with engines powered by coal, oil, and electricity. This shift altered more than transportation. It changed the relationship between human time and animal bodies. A train could continue through the night with changes of crew and fuel, while horses required feeding, recovery, and careful pacing. A truck could carry goods without producing manure in the street, though it created other forms of pollution and demanded roads, fuel, factories, and repair networks. Machines did not remove dependence, they transferred it from pasture, grain, and stable labour to mines, wells, refineries, power stations, and industrial systems. The horse slowly vanished from the center of daily economic life because the new forms of power could be multiplied in ways animal reproduction could not match. No breeding program could produce a mature working horse as quickly as a factory, could assemble another engine once materials and labor were available. No stable could make an exhausted animal recover on command. Industrial power separated movement from the biological pace that had limited civilization for centuries. In fields, tractors could pull heavier equipment for longer hours, reducing the number of draft animals needed, while in war, trucks, tanks, aircraft, and rail transport changed the scale and speed of supply. Cavalry did not disappear immediately, and horses continued to serve in scouting, transport, policing, and difficult terrain. But they were increasingly pushed toward the edges of systems once built around them. The same happened in cities. Delivery wagons, carriages, and horse-drawn public transport gave way to motor vehicles, while stables were converted, demolished, or moved away from crowded centres. Workers whose knowledge had been essential faced a quieter kind of loss. Drivers, stable hands, farriers, harness makers, breeders, and wagon builders saw their skills become less central, even when parts of that knowledge survived in sport, rural work, ceremony, or military tradition. At the beginning of the human relationship with horses, survival had depended on learning to read fear, fatigue, hunger, and movement. Industrialization reduced the number of people who practiced that daily attention. Children growing up in modern cities could live their entire lives without touching a horse, even though the shape of their streets and the location of old markets had been formed during an age of hooves. The retreat of horses also changed the animals themselves. Populations bred for transport or heavy labor declined. Some local types disappeared, and many surviving horses entered new roles connected with recreation, racing, breeding, policing, tourism, therapy, or cultural identity. This transition was not simply liberation from animal labor. Because working horses remained necessary where machines were too expensive, fuel was scarce, or terrain was difficult, nor was it simply technological progress. Because engines brought accidents, pollution, military destruction, and new forms of economic dependence. What ended was not effort, but one ancient arrangement of effort. Roads widened, fuel stations replaced watering points, repair garages replaced many workshops, and schedules became less tied to the recovery of animals, while the ordinary sounds and smells of urban life changed so gradually that one generation could scarcely recognize another. Human societies stopped asking millions of living bodies to carry the ordinary movement of civilization and began asking machines to do so instead. The horse that had once stood at the center of distance, labor, war, and communication became less visible, but the world built around its former presence did not disappear with it. Although horses disappeared from the center of modern transport, they did not disappear from the structures they had helped create. Their presence remains hidden in language, measurement, streets, customs, and habits so familiar that their origins are easy to overlook. We still describe engines through horsepower, using the body of an animal as a bridge between older forms of work and industrial energy. The term does not mean that one mechanical horsepower perfectly reproduces the effort of one living horse in every condition, yet its survival reveals how deeply people once understood power through animal labor. Machines became easier to imagine when compared with the strength that farms, mines, roads, and workshops already knew. Even after engines replaced horses, the old body remained inside the new vocabulary. Urban space carries similar traces. Many streets were shaped for carts, carriages, mounted patrols, watering places, markets, and stable yards before motor traffic existed. Road widths, turning spaces, old inns, coaching stations, and the location of commercial districts often preserve decisions made for animals and vehicles that are no longer present. Some buildings retain large doors, ramps, stone floors, iron rings, or interior courtyards created for horses, even when they now serve offices, homes, restaurants, or storage. A modern pedestrian may pass through such spaces without hearing hooves, yet the arrangement of movement still follows patterns established during the horse-powered city. The same inheritance appears in distance. Settlements, postal routes, military roads, and stopping places were often separated according to how far animals could travel before rest, feed, or replacement became necessary. Later railways and highways sometimes followed older corridors because generations of horse traffic had already identified useful passes, crossings, water sources, and connections between population centres. Modern speed can therefore move along paths first organised by slower living bodies. At the origin of human mobility, routes were formed by feet, memory, and the search for resources. Horses widened those routes, and industrial transport inherited many of them rather than beginning from an empty landscape. Language preserves a quieter archive. People hold their horses, get back in the saddle, take the reins, change horses, or speak of dark horses without thinking about the practical world that gave these expressions meaning. Political authority is still described through reins and bridles. Economic strength is still measured by power associated with the horse. These phrases survive because the relationship was once ordinary enough to provide common images for control, patience, uncertainty, recovery, and competition. Horses also remain visible in ceremony, sport, policing, tourism, ranching, and forms of rural labour where terrain or tradition continues to support their use. Racing and equestrian competition preserve specialised breeding, training, and wealth, though they represent only a narrow portion of the older partnership. Mounted units appear in parades and public order, linking modern institutions to earlier displays of authority. In some settings, carefully managed contact with horses is used for education, recreation, or therapeutic support, but these activities do not recreate the economic world in which entire cities depended on equine labour. They belong to a different relationship, one shaped more by choice than necessity. Memory has also softened the past. Paintings and films often preserve elegant carriages, open landscapes, or heroic riders while leaving manure, injury, feeding costs, stable labour, and exhausted animals outside the frame. The horse becomes a symbol of freedom after the systems that constrained both horse and worker have faded from daily sight. This selective memory matters because it can turn dependence into romance. The modern world did not simply move beyond the horse, it carried forward roads, words, institutions, hierarchies, and ideas of speed that had been formed through centuries of living beside it. The animal became less visible precisely because its influence had already been built into the shape of ordinary life, waiting beneath modern movement like an older road beneath new pavement. Its older rhythm continues beneath the language of progress. The horse did not create civilization alone, and human history would not have stopped without it, but the long partnership between our species changed the scale at which people could act. Horses altered the relationship between distance and time, allowing journeys, messages, trades, migrations, and military movements to happen sooner than walking bodies permitted. They changed labour by transferring weight from human shoulders into harness, carts, saddles, and living muscle. They changed politics by giving rulers, messengers, soldiers, merchants, and landowners unequal access to speed. They changed generations because knowledge of feeding, handling, breeding, healing, riding, and driving had to be preserved before the animal could remain useful. None of these changes came from the horse alone. Wheels, metalwork, farming, writing, states, trade, and cooperation all mattered. Yet the horse connected these systems by making movement repeatable across distances that had once separated communities through delay. This is the deeper meaning of saying that one animal rewired civilization. The horse did not change the human brain in a sudden biological event. It changed the networks through which human decisions reached other people. A warning could arrive before an attack. A ruler could influence a province without travelling there. A trader could connect producers and buyers. A family could maintain ties across a wider territory. An army could move farther, while the people who supplied it carried burdens. Speed entered law, wealth, status, conflict, and memory. Every expansion of movement raised questions about who controlled the animals, who supplied the land, who performed the care, and who faced the mounted power of others. The history of the horse therefore teaches more than a story of progress. It shows that technology is often a relationship rather than an object. A horse was not a machine waiting to be used. It was a living being with fear, fatigue, hunger, pain, social bonds, and limits. Human societies gained power only by learning enough about those limits to work within them, or by ignoring them and accepting the damage that followed. The partnership could include trust and skilled care, but it could also become exploitation when speed, profit, or victory mattered more than the animal beneath the demand. This lesson remains useful in a world no longer powered mainly by hooves. Modern systems seem different because energy now comes through engines, electricity, digital networks, and industrial supply chains. Convenience appears in one place while its cost is carried somewhere else. A journey becomes faster because roads, fuel, labour, minerals, machines, and distant landscapes have been organised to support it. A message arrives instantly because hidden infrastructures remain active day and night. Just as a carriage concealed the stable, modern speed can conceal the people, resources, and environments that make it possible. Civilization is not built only by celebrated inventions or powerful individuals. It is built by networks of dependence, many of them quiet and easily forgotten. The horse reminds us that human history has always been shared with other forms of life. Our cities, languages, borders, wars, markets, and ideas of power were shaped partly by an animal that never understood the empires it carried. This does not reduce human responsibility. It deepens it. The more power we gain through another body or system, the greater our duty to notice where the cost is paid. Progress should not be measured only by how quickly we move, how much we carry, or how far authority can reach. It should also be measured by how carefully we understand the lives and labour supporting that movement. Horses gave human beings access to a larger world, but they also revealed that every extension of power creates a new dependence. Their age at the centre of civilization has largely passed, yet the question they leave behind remains close. What systems are carrying our world forward now, and what hidden lives, limits, and costs have we still not learned to see?